Well, good morning, all. A warm welcome to all gathered here, especially any who might be new or hasn't perhaps even been to church in a long time, wherever you're coming from. We're so glad you're here. The line that just really stood out to me in the gospel, I could preach on any line, and anyone who knows me knows that, but the line that really struck me was where this line happened. So they, the shepherds, they went in haste, and they found Mary and Joseph and the infant. And that little phrase, just this past week, just really stood out to me just a little bit more than usual, like, and the infant. As opposed to what? Have you ever kind of thought, like, maybe just in the back of your mind, maybe like a little fantasy idea or like a what if, like, gosh, if I were God, if I were all powerful, I would. Have you ever kind of filled in the blank? That's what the movie Bruce Almighty back in the early 2000s was based off of. Remember that? If I were God, of course, Bruce Almighty is this movie about like this guy who has all these superpowers and he does all these crazy fanatical things, like, and it's sometimes like how where our own hearts can drift. Like, if I had all the power, I would do X, Y, Z. But I don't think anyone would say, if I were God, I would come to the world as an infant. This is so distinctly Christian that in our own wayward ways, we so often we pride ourselves in self-sufficiency, kind of pulling ourselves up on our bootstraps, if you will, the American way, but it goes beyond the American way. It's kind of the way of the human heart. We like self-sufficiency. I would come as, well, a great fighter, perhaps a fully mature man, maybe 6'5", and say, like, and I'm going to smite the Romans. You've been waiting for the Messiah? Well, I am here. But that's not the line. They went in haste and found Mary and Joseph and the infant. The way that God comes to us is through, among many other things, vulnerability. Now, if any of you have studied any Latin before, we learned a lot of our English words through Latin roots. Vulnerability comes from the Latin vulnus, which means wound. And you put the ability, vulnerability, in it's really a capacity to be wounded. It's like a little infant. They're very vulnerable. Like a newborn deer, for example. They're so helpless. They're so vulnerable to threats, to the wolves. Yes. God willingly becomes vulnerable, showing us his wounds. Why? Not because he is in himself helpless. God is all powerful, is he not? But the way that God comes to us is through vulnerability so that we might become vulnerable. Because Jesus means the Savior, one who saves. What is he saving? Well, the human heart, which is very complex, is it not? It's very hard to even understand ourselves. Why do I do what I do? Have you ever had this? Like, Jesus Christ is the Savior who comes to save. And have you ever had this like perplexing question in your mind? Like, I want to do good, but I don't know why I don't. St. Paul says this in Romans 7. It's like, why do I do the very things that I don't want to do? And the things that I do want to do, I can't do them. This is the mystery of sin. And yet, a great way that God comes in almost through the back door is through vulnerability, so that our own hearts might become, which are often very hardened. Sin always hardens us. But God, through his vulnerability, when we become vulnerable, like our hearts, like we use that little phrase, like, oh, my heart melted. Yes. And not just when Christ became an infant. The whole way of God was through vulnerability. Certainly as the infant, he comes to be held. Can you imagine being a rough shepherd with calluses on your hand and stinking like sheep? They do actually smell really bad. And when you're like, this is the Savior of the world. Imagine this crusty old, someone who lives in the sticks, one of these shepherds, like having tears in his eyes. It will move a grown man, hardened by the winds of the wilderness, into saying, if God can become this small, it starts to move us. And I wonder if in your relationship with God, all of us in our different place, Sometimes we're very resistant to showing our wounds to God. And yet then we sometimes kind of lament, I wish I had more intimacy with God. I wish God were closer to me. I would encourage you that this Christmas, calling to mind that Christ became an infant, he became vulnerable. The measure that you and I become vulnerable with God, who is vulnerable, is the measure of our intimacy with God. Maybe just a few little anecdotal stories. When I went to seminary, I'd really started encountering Jesus leading up to that. I started to be quite moved by the reality. I had some mystical experiences, you could say, that kind of awakened me to the presence of that God had a heartbeat, that God was real. And so eventually that helped me starting to discern seminary. But in seminary, you're around a lot of bright lights. A lot of guys are taking the Lord very seriously. And sometimes there can be a tendency to be like, gosh, I shouldn't sin if I'm even in seminary. But I did. And one day, a few years into seminary, I was like, well, I'm a sinner. I need to go to confession. But if you go to confession at the seminary, the confessional is right by the front door. So when you stand in line, everyone sees you. And there's this little humbling attitude, like the guys are like, Jake's in the line here. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of standing there very vulnerable, waiting for the confessional. There's actually a line in confessional, but you just feel a little vulnerable. And I remember one of the priests on staff came in through the front door, and of course he had to kind of step by me, and then he came up to me, and I was like, and I just felt very vulnerable. He came up and whispered, "Are you a sinner?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Me too." And he got in line behind me. And something happened. It moved my heart. All of us are in the same playing field. No matter what our credentials, no matter where we've come from, if a good family, bad family, where we went to college, what our educational standards are, what we've accomplished, what your resume looks like, at the end of the day, Christ became, who had all power, willingly became weak and vulnerable. In the words of St. Paul, Christ, although he was rich, became poor, so that by his poverty we might become rich. And my point this morning on this Christmas day is that if you want intimacy with God, oftentimes the measure of our closeness with God is the measure of our becoming vulnerable with God. And not afraid to put down the armaments that we have, our weapons of our defenses, our pride, maybe just our shame. This is a line that has always struck me. C.S. Lewis has been very impactful in my life. When I started to read Mere Christianity, that book moved me. It started to help me taking God seriously. And this is a line from C.S. Lewis. He says, "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything or anyone, and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure you keep your heart intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements, certainly relationships. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in the casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. God, who is perfect love and all power, does not come as a fully mature soldier. He comes as a little infant, helpless, weak, vulnerable, so that by his vulnerability, it might draw out from our crusty hearts a certain kind of vulnerability. Again, this is the whole pattern of Christ's life, not just as a little infant. His whole life was poor. He had nowhere to lay his head. Something happens even when we kind of see someone very well dressed. It's not like we're immediately judging them per se, but they're like, well, they had their life together. But when you see someone who's less than you, you feel the inequality. By Christ's poverty, he was able to elicit a vulnerability in human hearts. Certainly on the cross. When you look at the cross, we see what we most often see, which is Christ still has a little bit of clothing on him. It was not so Christ was naked on the cross. Now, this is something maybe some of you have heard from Corrie ten Boom. She was a Dutch woman living around the time of World War II. She wasn't a Jew, but during the time of World War II, Corrie ten Boom and her family, especially her sister, they couldn't help but see the plight of the Jews who were being horrendously treated. And so they secretly tried to save many of them. And this is one of the most popular books in the last couple of years called The Hiding Place. And Corrie ten Boom highlights in this paragraph, she recalls how at Ravensbrück, which was one of the worst Nazi concentration camps, we don't hear as much about this one, but at Ravensbrück, she says this, the prisoners were required to strip naked every Friday for the reoccurring humiliation of so-called medical inspections, where the naked prisoners standing in line were not allowed to use their hands to cover themselves, but had to stand erect with their hands at their sides. One Friday, as I stood behind my frail and dying sister Betsy, the thought came to me, he hung upon the cross naked. I whispered this to Betsy, Christ hung upon the cross naked. They took his clothes too. Betsy received great comfort and strength from this and stood up a little straighter. The difference of the details of the denigration of Jesus made all the difference. Christ became humble, weak, helpless, and vulnerable so that by his vulnerability, it might draw out from our crusty hearts a certain vulnerability. Sometimes even I try to do this in prayer when prayer can sometimes seem, like for anyone, sometimes a little stale, boring, and sometimes I don't even want to pray. Can you hear a priest say that? But I will tell the Lord that. Lord, for whatever reason, I don't even want to pray right now. And all of a sudden it starts to become some of the most powerful prayer I've ever had. When I'm vulnerable enough to tell the Lord exactly what's going on in me. And not trying to put up a posture of, Lord, I love you. When I'm like, but I don't very much right now. I wonder if we might on this Christmas and this Christmas season, allow the Lord's infancy and his vulnerability to draw that a little bit more out of us, wherever we might be, young or old, great resume or not so great, broken family or not so broken. Everyone has brokenness. And everyone who has ever attempted to love, it means you have to become vulnerable. Christ, by his vulnerability, willingly came down to our levels to draw out in our hardened hearts, really to know that we need a Savior. I'm not self-sufficient. And as soon as I start realizing and living like that, I'm capable of a Savior.